Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem.
They weren't even close to where the
And I find it
Jews just need Torah. I don't care what anybody says. At some level,
I am enjoying it so
And
much
questions
because
after.
like the Rebbe said, you have to learn something 101 times before,
100%.
and that's what I'm doing, learning it again and again. And
It's very
honestly
hard.
say, I'm on the staircase.
Well, I shouldn't
At
talk
what
about
level?
It's recorded now.
good. Oh, you started reading the book?
Of course.
Good.
I'm nearly finished.
I've got to give you one first.
Yeah, Parashat.
Yeah, before you leave.
Okay.
Yeah. I forgot all about it. So,
We should start.
huh? We should start. Yeah. Well, there's still a chair left.
After all this politics, we should start.
Next week there's not you.
Yeah,
Oh,
next
Deb,
week.
can I give you something before you leave? So, will you remind me just before you leave? Thanks.
No, but for next 2 weeks, there's no show, isn't it?
No, next
2 weeks.
next 2 weeks is Yontif next week and Yontif the week after.
Okay.
Yontif ends, of course, Tuesday night, the second week, but I won't have Korea. Last week we did a shir on Pesach because of the fact that it is Pesach next week, and I couldn't do everything in one go, so I did about half of it last week and try and do the other half this week. Just so that you know how this has been divided up, the Rebbe it has sikhs which basically divide into these two categories. There's the concept of a Jew finding his Yetzias Mitzrayim, his exit from bondage as an individual, and that's what we were learning last week. And there's the second side of that is of Jews understanding their entry into freedom as a nation, as opposed to as an individual. That's what we're going to be learning tonight. What we're going to be learning tonight is a sikha from, for the people that require this, it's from volume 17, page 71 of the Likkutei Sikhs. And before I start on this, I just, by the way, this is Champagne Rebbe. This sikha is really, really Champagne Rebbe, in the sense that this is the Rebbe's style par excellence. He will take a piece of Torah where you read it and you see these words, and he will take these words and apply his belief system to it. What's his belief system to it? The Torah is God's wisdom. It's absolutely perfect. It applies to every Jew in every generation. Every word is in the right order, and if the words are in that order, it means that they have a reason to be in that order. And he works with that and drains out of that a wisdom for you and me on an everyday level. So that's how the Rebbe learns in some of the most exciting sikhs. This is one of them. This is real Champagne Rebbe stuff. Before we start, I just want to repeat something that I've said in the shir a few times, but it's worth repeating. The Rebbe asked a question somewhere else, unrelated to this, that when Avraham got the brocha from Hashem, the bris between the parts, as it's called, Hashem blesses Avraham with progeny, which is as many as the grains of sand on the ground and as many as the stars in the sky. And the Rebbe asks the question, why was it necessary for the Torah to say both of those things? Everyone knows there are more stars in the sky than there are grains of sand. No matter how many grains of sand there are, current scientific belief is that there's 400 billion galaxies. So in 400 billion galaxies, it's a no-brainer, it's no competition. So why wouldn't it have been sufficient, asks the Rebbe, to simply say, I'll give you a blessing that you'll have as many children as there are stars in the sky, because that will include the number of grains in the sand. And he explains this. He explains that Jews have to understand that they have two dimensions to their consciousnness. One dimension to their consciousness is that they're part of a whole, where each Jew is part of Am Yisrael. And when Israel's attacked by rockets, we are all attacked. We are all vulnerable. We're all fussed about it. Why? Because like grains of sand on a beach, it's all the sand together that is the valuable thing. 1 or 2 grains of sand in your shoe is an irritant. The beauty of sand is what it is when it's together with all other bits of sand. But with the stars in the sky, the Rebbe explains that each star has to shine with its own light. So that every Jew, although we are part of Am Yisrael and we need to bond with each and every Jew, at the same time, every Jew has the responsibility of living their life, shining their own light, contributing their own light, which is special, and without which there is no creation. There's no reason for them to be alive. So last week, we were learning the stars in the sky version of that consciousness, and we learned that Yisrael went into Mitzrayim. I'm not going to repeat it. Anyone can listen to it on the telephone if they want to, but I'll just summarize it in 3 words. Mitzrayim is bondage. It's being tied down. It's being prevented from flexing one's muscles, whether they're physical or mental or spiritual or whatever. Last week we learned that Yitzias Mitzrayim is the breaking out of that bondage, the escape from that, which is helped by miracles on the way. But then for a Jew to reach real freedom, he has to be able to exercise real free choice. And real free choice comes in overcoming triggers. That's what the Shia was really about last week. Each one of us have our triggers. Those triggers are partly from what we learned, our koiches hanefesh, the things that we're born with in our soul, the way we're hardwired. And part of those triggers are the environment that we've lived through and the pressures and troubles and traumas that we've faced, and that leaves an imprint, and that becomes a trigger, so that when if a big guy with a red face bashed you up when you were 4, every time you see a big guy with a red face, you have a negative reaction to it. However, we learned that there is a space. There's a space between the trigger and the reaction, which is Das Elohim. We haven't got time to go through it. Anyone should look it up if they want to, or go back one sheet to find it. But basically, Das Elohim means that you have so great a belief and trust in your God, so clear a dialogue with your own God, that when something negative happens, you are free to ignore it by going back to first principles, that you have a God who's creating the world every moment. That means there's Ashkocha Pratis, that everything he's doing is for the good, everything that's happening to you is deliberate, and you can then choose to move out of the range of that trigger and choose a pathway for yourself at that moment. That is a real Yitzias Mitzrayim individually. That's what we learned last week. What we're going to learn this week is we're going to learn about us as a nation. We're talking about sand on the beach. We are one grain of sand on a beach, but that beach is a cohesive whole. And we have an obligation, just as we have an obligation to shine our individual light, we have an obligation to express ourselves and be part of Am Yisrael generally. And the Rebbe says that the Rebbe points out a piece of Torah, which I'll share with you, and I'm sure you all know it. There are actually three terms that we use for the Yontif of Pesach. The first is matzah. That's the Torah expression. The Torah says it's a time for matzahs. And that's the word that's used in the Chumash. That's the word that's used in the Torah. Then we have the words that we use in davening, which is Zman Cheruseinu, which means the time of our freedom. That's the wording in the Siddur, or if you use one in the Maksah. We don't use a Maksah in Chabad, but the word is the same. The day of our liberation, the day of our Zman Cheruseinu is freedom, liberation. And then there is the most commonly used term by Am Yisrael generally in the street, in the shul, wherever they are. They call it Pesach. So there are three names for this holiday which are used all the time. One is matzah, the time of matzah. One is time of freedom, and one is Pesach. Pesach literally means to jump over, Passover. Yeah, that's right, Passover. So those three terms are used, and they're used in that order because Torah comes first, davening comes second, and the terminology that we use with one another comes third. And the Rebbe says this, that if you have three expressions about something in Torah, they must all be connected. Not only, and this is what I said by Champagne Torah, this is how the Rebbe really learns, that they must be all connected. Not only must they all be connected, they must be connected in that order, serially. That's a specific, intentional order from which you can learn and from which you can generalize. And that terminology is really code for understanding each of those three descriptions, putting them together and understanding that that is our life as Am Yisrael. So l'chaim. So before we go further on this journey, I also want to explain a perspective. That's all it is. And I try and say it every year because to me it's so beautiful. So for those people who've heard it before and can remember it, I'm happy. I have nachas if you can remember it. But if it's new to you, then you'll like it as much as I did when I heard it the first time. The Rebbe says this. He says that at the Seder on Seder night, there are various steps that everybody, we haven't got time for it here, but one of the steps is the breaking of the middle matzah and putting away half of it as for the afikoimen. And we hide the afikoimen, and there are various minhagim. Some people, the children steal it. In Chabad, the stealing's not encouraged. Probably the Rebbe's thought that there's too much stealing as it is. So our kids don't steal it, but they do try and find it. and it is our minhag to hide it. So, and we can't finish the Seder without it. When it comes time for at the end of the Seder, as you know, we find the afikomen, and that's the last thing we eat or drink that night. So the Rebbe says this. He says, this is the history of our people. The history of our people is that the larger part, by the way, the afikomen is the larger part of when you break it into two, it's the larger part that's put away as afikomen. The Rebbe says that in our history, the larger part of Am Yisrael broke away. The larger part of Am Yisrael gets hidden away. They either leave, they stop keeping Torah and mitzvahs, they get disguised by their lifestyles and behaviors and all the rest of it. Some marry out and whatever the reason is, they are away from the Seder table of Jewish life. But says the Rebbe, you can't finish the Seder without them. So you have to go and get that afikomen and bring it back to the Seder table. And this is a wonderful insight into the Rebbe's perspective of the importance of each and every Jew. The Rebbe was fond of saying that if the Nazis, Yomach Shemoy, thought it important enough to find and hunt down every single last Jew, no matter whether they thought they changed their religion or didn't, no matter whether they hid or didn't hide, whether they married out or didn't marry out, whatever if it was enough for them to hunt us down, to kill us, it's enough for you and me to hunt every Jew down we can and love them and bring them back to the Seder table. And that's because we are all part of Am Yisrael and we are all part of the sand on the beach. And being that we're part of the sand on the beach, the Rebbe then explains that why we celebrate Pesach is we celebrate the birth of a nation and the birth of our freedom. Let's understand this. The birth of our nation and the birth of our freedom. And that is we're talking about a communal idea. We're not talking about an individual idea. That was last week. We're talking about a communal idea, the birth of a nation as a nation, Am Yisrael as a nation, and the birth of our freedom as a nation. Forget about the freedom as an individual, that we did last week, and it's very important. And that's the stars in the sky each shining with their own light. But we are now talking about the birth of a nation as a group entity. And he says that to understand that, you have to understand these three terms of Torah. It's incredible that the Rebbe will take something that's in front of your face and give you a whole lesson in Torah and avoider and how we live from it. So he says that there are actually three stages in the development of our freedom. And in order for there to be those three stages, you have to understand what those three stages are, but at the same time, understand that those three stages are really three facets of one diamond. It's one diamond. Am Yisrael is one diamond, but the facets of the diamond are these three stages. The first stage is matzah. What's matzah? Matzah is, as you know, unleavened bread. What does that mean? It means bread that is not allowed to rise. The metaphor for chometz, that which rises, is ego, is feelings of self-importance for nothing. And before, the Rebbe explains that before there can be any real growth at any level, a person has to first unload yeshus, has to first unload the ego, has to first unload, and he gives an example of the Kiddush cup, that you can't put wine into a Kiddush cup if it's full of water. So if you want to fill a Kiddush cup if you want to fill a keli with wine, you've got to get rid of the water first. If you want to fill a Jewish soul with brachas from Hashem, you have to get rid of that which is in there in the way. And that is yeshus. That is this concept of ego. Now, I'll spend 2 or 3 minutes on this because it's a very misunderstood concept. The word we use is bittul. Bittul means self-nullification, but actually it doesn't. Bittel's almost impossible to translate. It means self-nullification. It means feelings of inadequacy, depression, anxiety, all of the things that tear a person down is part of the wrong side of bittul. The healthy side of bittul we'll learn in a minute. So it means like this, that let's say you have a person that's very talented. He's a very talented tennis player, or he's a very talented politician, or he's a very great, I don't know, fisherman, whatever he is. There are 2 ways he can look at his talent. He can look at his talent and boast about it and be proud of it and accept the accolades that he gets, or he can understand that those talents were given to him by Hashem. He did nothing to earn those talents. He's got terrific eyeball coordination. Yeah, he practices. I agree. We all agree with that. Yeah, he has to do some work. But fundamentally, there are some people you can give them 1,000 lessons. I'm sure Ronan can testify to this. You can give my daughters, you can give them, my daughters I used to try and get them to play tennis. I wanted a playmate when they were very little. And so I bought them dresses because that's what they wanted, to play tennis. And we had a tennis coach then, a Hungarian. Did I ever tell you the story about him?
Yeah.
And he used to come here and one day on Sunday mornings, and he'd come back down from the tennis court, and he was talking to my wife, and he said to my wife, Mrs. Kremnizer, I can't do it anymore. I can't take your money. They will never hit the ball over the net, ever. But give me your son, he said. When your son can see over the net, he'll be able to hit the ball. So some people you just can't. They don't. And some people have a natural talent, and that natural talent needs to be understood for what it is. It's a God-given gift. And instead of boasting about it, you've got a responsibility to utilize it to the best of your ability. So bittul is not saying, I'm not the man for the job. That's no good. The Lubavitcher Rebbe knew he was the man for the job, I promise you. He didn't think that Chaim Yankel down the road in the gutter, the drunk, should be doing his job. He knew that he should be doing his job. What's the terror of a tzaddik? The terror of a tzaddik is whether he's doing his job to the level of potential that Hashem has given him to do that job. And when he feels like that, he's not proud, and he's not, he's not boastful of his talent, because he understands that the talent is God-given and he's got a responsibility for it. Now, that's what real bittul is. Real bittul is not thinking you're a doormat or being a doormat. Real bittul is being who you are and living up to who you are, but not believing that your gifts are yours, but that they're given to you by Hashem, and they're given to you Hashem for a specific reason, and they're a responsibility that you've got. And if you're clever, your responsibility is to use that clever to help your wife and children and family and elevate the world. And if you're good at sport, and if you're good at sport enough to earn enough money, don't be stupid enough to think that you're earning the money. It's your brocker that comes from the ability to play the sport, and you have a potential to how to spend the money. You have to give tzedakah. You have to all the things that we learn in other places. But the symbol of that, to remind every one of us that we eat matzah for 7 days, or in the diaspora 8 days, in Golis 8 days. Why do we eat the matzah for that time? Because we ingest a food which is designed to make us remember what bittul is and what yeshus is, what ego is. And ego is unhealthy and bad, and bittul is healthy and good. Doesn't mean you don't recognize your talents, but you recognize them for what they are. Now, why don't we, if that's so terrific, why don't we eat matzah all year? Why do we eat bread for the rest of the year? Because for the nefesh habahamis, for those who are more in tune with this, you need a certain amount of ego. You need a certain amount of yeshus. But there is a point of time in the year where that's an alarm clock that I don't know how to turn off. It stops in a minute. Somebody will help me a grandchild will help me turn it off. So that's what the matzah is. Then the next level is Zman Chayruseinu, the level of our freedom. And that requires, as we're going to see in a minute from an example the Rebbe uses from a Rav and Talmud, from a teacher and a student, that is when we bring to focus not only our God-given talent, which we have to have a lack of yeshus for, lack of ego for, but we bring the talents that we do have to bear on our position. So we join with our fellow Jew in building. We join with our fellow Jew in achieving. We build societies. We build courts of law. We build cooperative things where we can bring to bear our intellect to better the cause of everybody else, of everybody around us. And then finally, we have the level which is called, which we refer to as Pesach, and Pesach as was translated means to pass over, but it means more than that. In Hasidus, it means grow. It means to fly, to jump, to leap. That you don't slush through a problem. You jump over it, and you're equipped to do that by first going through the bittul stage, second going through the intelligence stage, until you have that stage. So the Rebbe gives an example. And we're going to, I'll just give you a heads up on where this is going. The Rebbe is going to talk about the birth of our nation. And in order to talk about the birth of our nation, he's going to be talking about birth, generally. And in order to understand what the Rebbe is saying about birth, I have to give you some background, because the Rebbe doesn't bring this in the Sikha. So you have to understand that in our belief system, and not just in revealed Torah, but in Kabbalah and in Hasidus, I have to disabuse you of a common error. The common error is that birth is a natural phenomenon. You have to understand that that is not how we learn. We learn that birth is an entirely miraculous event. Why is it that it doesn't seem so? Because it happens so often. And because it happens so often, a miracle becomes less obvious if it happens all the time. when the sun rises and sets every day at predictable moments calculable to microseconds, we don't think that's a miracle because we call that nature. Why? Because it happens all the time. And we think that birth is nature because it happens all the time. It happens to human beings, it happens to animals, it happens to trees. So we think of birth as part of the natural cycle of birth and death. You have to understand that that is not how we learn in Kabbalah and Hasidus. We learn in Kabbalah and Hasidus that it is an absolute miracle. And there are some things that underpin that. I might as well go through some of them now. First of all, let's take a human being. The methodology which is known to everybody is that a woman is impregnated with a man's sperm, and if the sperm fertilizes an egg, you have a new life, right? And the danger is to believe that that is in some way natural. But I ask you, if you think about it, you'll understand that what has the sperm got to do with what the egg has that can create a new life? And you've got to understand what this new life is. It's not, the new life is not 1 and 1 equals 2. It's not the father contribution, the mother contribution. So you have an offspring which is part father and part mother. The reality is you have father contribution, a mother contribution, and an offspring which is unique and a new life. So it's 1 and 1, 1 plus 1 produces 1. Doesn't produce 2 halves of the previous parent. It produces a new life, an entirely new life. And to illustrate how true that is for a parent, I'm talking about healthy parents in normal relationships. I'm not talking about dysfunctional people who cripple their children, God forbid, with madness. But for healthy parents, what's the biggest nachas you can have as a parent? That with all the love and care and attention that you give your child as it grows up, one day your biggest nachas is that the child says goodbye. I'm leaving home. I'm starting my life, and I want to have my own life. And you want him to have his own life. If he's going to be your a mini version of you and going to sit in your house for the rest of your life, it's a tragedy. So 1 and 1 doesn't equal the sum of those 2 parts. 1 and 1 should equal, in a normal situation, a free, new individual, a new birth. Now, the new birth happens but physiologically at the beginning, but at some point in that child's development, the child becomes himself and is able to rely on himself. I'm talking about healthy people here, right? Able to rely on himself without reference to his parents other than as fond memories or as obviously he loves them, and obviously there's a tied metzias one with the other, but the child becomes an individual, separate entity. And his biggest freedom, and the biggest freedom you can give that child, is the ability to make his own choices. That's the biggest freedom you can give him. So, the Rebbe's going to come to that with Am Yisrael as a nation. But in order to do that, he uses a mashal. So I need to explain the mashal to you. The mashal goes like this, that he uses the mashal of Rav and Talmud. That means teacher and student. So you have a teacher, and there are 2 ways to learn this mashal. I should tell you, this mashal is used in Torah generally and in Hasidus in particular, hundreds and hundreds of times in all the Rebbeim's Torah. And there are 2 separate pathways to this learning. One we're not going to learn tonight, and one we are. The one we're not going to learn tonight, I'll just fill in for you very quickly. It goes like this. We have a concept, very deep, very difficult. If I'm overloading you, just cruise through me. That when Hashem created the world, in order to create the world, before in inverted commas creation, there was only a blaze of godliness. Nothing could exist in that. Nothing separate could exist in that, because all there was godliness, blazing godliness. In order to create the physicality, the illusion of something separate, because that's all it is, because we have a saying in Torah, Ein Oed Milvadoi, there's nothing else but Hashem. In order to create the illusion of separateness, which is, by the way, a very deep clipper. We haven't got time for that now. The illusion of separateness, Hashem had to go through what's called the tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means contraction. He kind of contracted his light, and into the darkness of that contraction of light, he introduced a thing called the kav, and from that there's a reduced level of light into which the process of creation could take place. But the steps are contraction and darkness, into which comes light, and then out of that light comes a creation. So because that's Torah, it's going to be a pattern throughout everything, like all Torah is. Every piece of Torah is existent at every level of our lives. So if you have a husband and wife, and the husband takes up all the space, takes up all the light in the room, you're not going to have a marriage, because she's going to either be crushed or she's going to run away. How do you have a satisfactory relationship with a wife or a child or a business partner or a friend? You've got to give him space. You've got to give him some room. So there has to be a level of contraction, a level of tzimtzum, into which he can flourish, and then he flourishes and you flourish. That's the example of Rav and Talmud. So in that with that background, that pathway of Rav and Talmud, of teacher and student, goes like this: that if a teacher needs to teach something to a student, he has to go through the same process. Imagine, for example, a professor of quantum mechanics comes in here to teach us mathematics. And he starts with the top levels of his probability equations. Odds are, we're not going to understand a word he's saying, right? How can he teach us quantum mechanics? He's first got to batten down his knowledge. He's first got to contract his knowledge down to a few simple ideas. 2 and 2 is 4, and when you've got that, 2 times 4 is 8, and whatever it is, and then you learn what an equation is, and you learn how to add and subtract, and then slowly you can build on it. But in order for him to transfer his knowledge to you, it first has to be battened down into a level which you can accept, which you can take. Otherwise you just get flooded and you know nothing. So he leaves and you learn nothing from the evening, right? That process, and paradoxically, for you to have a giloi, for you to have a light in what he's teaching you, he's got to batten down his light. Otherwise you're not going to receive it. That's the Rav and Talmud mashal for the teacher and the student with the passing of the information. But the Rebbe is using this example for a different thing altogether. He's now focusing not on the teacher and how the teacher can convey the information. He's focusing on the student, the learner, the child who needs to become free and an adult. So he says that for the child to learn anything from the teacher, And the Rebbe is fond of saying that a child is not necessarily the age on his passport. I'll share with you a personal experience. I don't know what a personal experience got to do with this year, but I'll tell you anyway. My first teacher is a man I love very much, and when we started to learn together, I thought I was very clever, and I was an absolute idiot. And he was very clever at teaching. How he taught me was, he saw that I was a big yesh, and he used to ask my opinion about things, right? Because a solicitor, people come to ask a solicitor opinion, so he asked my opinion on Torah, and of course I gave him advice. So, and one day he ran out of patience, and he said something, and I said, "Look, I don't agree." Right? And he stopped and he said, and I'll never forget it, he said to me, "It's time we talk the truth to each other." He said, "For the rest of our lives that we learn together, I need you to take a vow that you will never say you don't agree again, because you don't have the equipment to agree or disagree. What you can say is, I don't understand. And anything that you don't understand, that I don't explain properly to you, do yourself a favor, build yourself a mental shelf, and pack that away on that mental shelf. And one day you will understand it if you keep learning." Right? And that's exactly what I did. I listened to him. I built the shelf. And there were many things on that shelf over my lifetime. And many, many of them I've unpacked. Some I haven't, but most of them I have. And so that's step one of what the Rebbe is explaining here, is if the student wants to learn, the first thing he's got to do is undo his yeshes. Understand that he doesn't know what he in order to learn, he's got to face the fact that he doesn't know. And that is the concept of the matzah, of the flat matzah without any leaven, without any chometz, without any ego in it. The student has got to first empty himself out of his preconceived ideas, which may be correct, but if he's learning a new discipline, they're probably not correct. So, and that's step number one. Step number one is the matzah step. Now, step number two, the Rebbe is teaching you. So you've got to understand it. So you've got to bring your intellect to bear. And the harder you work with that, the harder you bring your intellect to bear, the bigger a chance you have of being able to accept the information and utilize it. But ultimately, the third step is that you have done that well enough that you are now not only at the level of information of your teacher and what your teacher is telling you, but you've extrapolated on that and grown from that yourself. You've actually passed over that limitation and gone further with the information yourself. And the Rebbe explains that that's true of a child reaching adulthood and independence. That first, the child's got to understand that his mummy and daddy know better. And second, he's got to learn. And then finally, he gets to a point where, when he leaves home, he says, "Thank you, Mum and Dad. I really respect everything you've taught me. You've taught me a lot. But now it's my turn. And it's my turn to fly." And that is real freedom. Now, there's a hope we don't run out of time here. Just, if this is too much, I want to explain this. This concept of freedom is one of the most misunderstood terms in Yiddishkeit. You know, freedom does not mean license to do whatever you like. That is not our definition of freedom. When Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson was here in Sydney and he used a fantastic mashal. He said that imagine that you're a fantastic violinist, and you can play Beethoven beautifully, right? Bach beautifully, and one day your violin complains to you, and you've got a Stradivarius violin, and it costs $2 million, and it's beautifully tuned, and one day your violin says to you, the strings are too tight. I'm not free. My strings aren't free. Set me free. So you undo the strings. You undo the strings. You don't have a violin, right? You're not going to make any noise at all. Certain things require structure for them to be functional. A Jew requires a certain amount of structure, Torah we learn, the mitzvahs that we do, to have freedom. Freedom doesn't mean, I'll give you another example from that same first teacher that I had. He once told me this. He said that he was on a train, and the guy next to him was boasting to him that he was going overseas, and that he had no one to account to. He was going overseas. No one will know where he is. He can do whatever he likes. He's got no responsibilities whatsoever. He's free, completely free. And my teacher explained to me, he didn't tell him, of course, but he explained to me that he feels so sorry for this guy. Why? Because no one's going to ring him while he's away, because he's so free. What does it mean that no one's going to ring him? No one cares. No one gives a damn about him. And the reality is that that's why nobody knows where he is, and that's why nobody's ringing him. And he said, when I go away, this my teacher said to me, my wife rings 3 times a day. Did I eat? Did I do this? And does it annoy me sometimes? It does. But on the other hand, she cares. The fact is, she cares. And when we ring home to God 3 times a day, we're ringing up to show we care. We're ringing up to actually show we care. That's why obviously you've got your own agenda and you're asking for things from Gashmias and Ruknias and all the rest of it. But the reality is that we're making contact, because that's how you make contact. Now, freedom does not mean being cut away from obligation. What it means is that within the boundaries of that obligation, you fulfill your responsibility, and that gives you freedom. So if a Jew lives a life as a Jew, there's a famous conversation that when Shazar, you know who he was. So when Shazar used to be a very religious boy in yeshiva, in Chabad yeshiva, in the Frierdiker Rebbe's, the previous Rebbe's yeshiva, and he was very naughty. He was very interested in philosophy, and he wasn't interested in Yiddishkeit, and the Rebbe used to threaten to throw him out. I don't know whether he actually threw him out or whatever happened. Years later, when Shazar became president of Israel, he went to the Lubavitch, the current Rebbe, right? And before he went to the current Rebbe, he went to see the Frierdiker Rebbe. They were both alive, and the Frierdiker Rebbe was still Rebbe. So when he went in to see the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe said, no, it's Makta, whatever his first name was.
Zalman.
Huh? Zalman, that's right. And he put his arm around him, and he was very warm to him, and Shazar said to him, Rebbe, the slave is free, but not happy. And the Rebbe replied to him that that's because he's a slave, and to be free, he would be happy. Right? So what does freedom mean? This is the issue. Does freedom mean being completely irresponsible? how that, and that if you stop someone in the street with a microphone in double bass, Mr. Jones, what's your definition of freedom? That I can do anything I want, providing I don't hurt anybody. That's what he's going to say. That is not our definition of freedom. Our definition of freedom is not that. You know, I'll tell you a fascinating thing. We have a pasuk which has been repeated, unfortunately, very inaccurately, especially when the Russians were trying to leave before Gorbachev. There was this whole thing of people used to demonstrate. You were probably still in Russia, so you don't know, but people used to demonstrate, right?
I left before.
You left before. So you remember. Rebbe was actually against it for a different reason, but people used to demonstrate. And they used to call out, "Let my people go," right? And the Rebbe was very upset with that because that's not the pasuk. The pasuk is, "Let my people go to serve me," right? That's freedom. For a Jew, you need both of those things. You need to be let go, but to serve Hashem. That's our freedom. So, l'chaim.
That's true.
My goodness, we're 5 minutes to go and 3 pages to go. How do you do that?
Contraction.
Yeah. So, Pesach celebrates the freedom of us as a tzibur. You know what the word tzibur comes from? I'm sure you've heard this. It's a combination of 3 words. Tzaddik, Beinani, Rosha. They're the 3 kinds of Jews. Saints, in-betweeners, bad people. Right? And you need all 3 for a Jewish congregation. I had a teacher, again, if I'm telling you about teachers, I had a teacher who told me he wouldn't daven in a shul where there isn't a guy breaking his teeth saying Kaddish. You know that? If you're in a shul where everybody can say Kaddish off by heart in their sleep, that's not a shul to daven in. You need a shul where there's a couple of guys who are really sincerely trying to say Kaddish and they're breaking their teeth to do it. That's a shul, right? So, we as a nation, as a tzibur, as a nation, made up of all 3 levels, of saints and bad people and people in between, we need to go through these 3 steps. This is the bottom line of the Sikha, that there needs to first be a communal sense of awe in our relationship with our God so that we have bittul, so that we have real self-nullification. That doesn't mean that we're doormats. We understand that the gifts that God's given us. We are grateful for the bounties that God's given us, but we understand that it all comes from Him and that our job is to form a relationship with Him without our ego. That's the matzah step. Then we have to go through the freedom step. We have to bring our intellect and our being and our and where did that come from historically? After Yetzias Mitzrayim, we went to Matan Torah. What for? To get the Torah. To get the very rules to help, to make us free. Because it's those rules and restrictions. Let my people go that they should serve me. How do you serve me? With those rules, with the Torah. That's what we got. That's why we went to Mount Sinai. That's what we got. And that's what makes Am Yisrael live forever. That's why we are Am Yisrael high, eternal, miraculous, ridiculously miraculous numerically. What are we? Less than 0.5% on this planet, right? And we outlive every host nation. I know I keep saying this, but one needs to remember this. We outlived every host nation. Why? Because we have this Torah. We have this bond with the Torah. But ultimately, the 3rd step is that we have to jump. We have to leap over every gashmius obstacle there is over every emotional obstacle there is, and understand that each one of us is a Helik Elokam Mimal, is a part of God Himself, made in God's image, infinitely able to achieve what God has given us to achieve, and that is our real freedom. And that's the second part of the concept of our freedom as a tzibur, as a nation, as this whole sand, each of us as Jews together. And we have an obligation to prop up each other and put our arms around each other and help each other and love each other and bring every piece of afikoimen back to the Seder table. So l'chaim, I wish everybody a happy Pesach.
Yeah.
You have to.
No,
Oh, you've done it. Oh, you've done it.
Everything under control.
Okay. Everybody should have a kosher and happy Pesach. As kosher as you can. Don't go crazy too early, but as kosher as you can, and as happy as you can. And don't forget that you've got the button on your happiness. So l'chaim.
Меня захватил, что ли? Меня захватил тоже.
Захватил.
Нет,
Не хотел.
Он очень большой захватчик.
теперь захватил.
Сюда.
Опа.
Еще.
Для потомства. For future generations.
Huh?
For future generations.
What? You're talking
Yeah,
Russian?
you say you didn't turn it far enough. Bring it around so you
Yes, that's right. Maybe it was you.